Welcome to the CFRD. Today we're going to be talking about reflux, aka acid reflux, aka heartburn, aka gastroesophageal reflux, aka GERD. So reflux, what is it? It's essentially when you have stomach acid and food particles going from your stomach up into your esophagus. And yes, that's the wrong direction. Typically, it should be going down. And people with CF can also have reflux even from their intestines up into their stomach and then up into their esophagus. So that means instead of just acid and food particles, you may also have bile and you may also have pancreatic enzymes in there as well. Again, none of those should be in your esophagus. And even worse, sometimes you can have microaspiration into your lungs, and those things should really not be in the lungs either. What are symptoms of reflux? So we all, again, think of heartburn and that feeling and sensation in your chest of burning feeling or pain in your chest or upper GI tract. You can also have like regurgitation, where basically you're having the feeling of those food particles or fluids and acid going up into your throat. That's also acid reflux or reflux that we know of. And you can have trouble swallowing and kind of that feeling, lump in your throat, things like that. For nighttime reflux, you have more likely to have symptoms like an ongoing cough. Obviously, that can be very hard to differentiate for those of us with CF because we likely have an ongoing cough. And we also can have hoarseness. That's something I experience. I'll have hoarseness in my throat. And that's just because of inflammation that's happening with your vocal cords. You can also have new or worsening asthma. And that's something that I also know that we see in the CF community as well, that we can also have asthma on top. So kind of interesting there that the play with those things. For infants and children, you're typically seeing feeding difficulties can happen, regurgitation of food, also, going back up into the esophagus, as well as abdominal pain. Those are more common in the little ones with CF. People with CF are at increased risk of having acid reflux as opposed to someone without CF. And typically in the non-CF community, when people have reflux, it's usually more associated with things like higher body weight or higher BMI, and smoking, which obviously that's not the CF community typically that we're talking about when we're talking about those things. So what makes the CF population different, and what kind of things are affecting our risk of having acid reflux or reflux? One of them is gastric emptying. So how fast your stomach actually empties after you eat food. For the CF population, it's variable. Some people have normal gastric emptying. Some people, their gastric emptying is actually fast. And for some people, it is slow. And when it's slow, it makes sense that if the food is kind of just sitting in your stomach for longer than it's supposed to, you'd be at increased risk of that food coming back up. Another one is you have actually this little valve, or called a sphincter, in between the bottom of your esophagus and the top of your stomach, the lower esophageal sphincter. And if that is not working properly, that gate's not working properly, also it makes sense that you would have a higher risk of having reflux. And there have been changes seen in that valve, in that sphincter for some people with CF. Another one is hiatal hernia, which again can be seen in the CF population, which is part of your stomach, or the top part of your stomach, actually poking up through the muscle above called the diaphragm. That can also increase risk of having reflux. Another one is changes in peristalsis or lessening of peristalsis in the esophagus. So peristalsis is the coordination of your esophagus when you swallow. So that has found to be affected in people with CF, for some people, not everybody, and that can increase your risk of reflux, and has thought to be part of the reflux as well at nighttime. So another one that's actually nutrition based is having a high fat diet. So we know that a lot of people with CF were typically asked to do a high fat diet because we have malabsorption of fat, and also fat provides a lot more calories than the other macronutrients being fat, protein, carbohydrates. So we tend to eat a higher fat diet. And fat is actually the slowest to digest of those three macronutrients. So it makes sense that, again, we're keeping that food sitting in our stomach longer. It's a chance that that's increasing our risk of reflux. And another thing is the postural drainage, or the things that we do to help get that mucus out. So I remember being a kid, before the vest and all that was around, my dad used to lay me down and do the pat treatment on me. And people also use postural drainage with their vests and other different things that they're doing to help get that mucus out of the lungs. And so, for instance, they found that for babies and infants, that the changes in postural drainage and how they were actually laying the child could increase that risk of reflux. So why does reflux matter? Of course, we know, and this is very important, that reflux creates symptoms that can make you feel uncomfortable on the day-to-day, during the day and through the night. I have woken up, I don't know if it happens to anyone else, but I literally wake up like, because I feel the acid coming up into my throat, and it's very uncomfortable, and my throat will usually bother me. I'll drink some water and it'll usually bother me for a while after that. So it's definitely an uncomfortable feeling, and it doesn't, it just doesn't feel good. But beyond that, it actually creates changes in our body that we don't really want to have. So it does increase our risk of something called Barrett's esophagus. So that is something, it's kind of pre-cancerous lesions in your esophagus and changes in your esophagus. And it actually increases your risk of esophageal cancer. So this is one really important reason to manage it, right? But it also affects your lungs. So when you reflux, you can have, all those particles from the reflux, so food particles, bile, pancreatic enzymes, acid going into your lungs. And it's called aspiration when that happens. And you can have micro aspirations happening that can actually affect your lungs and your lung function. So it's really important for us to actually manage it if we're noticing symptoms. But we do have to remember there's actually silent symptoms as well. So it's good to talk to your provider about it and see if it's something you should be concerned about. There's different ways that they can test for it, and a lot of different things that we can do to treat it. Let's get down to it and actually talk about what you can do nutritionally when it comes to acid reflux. What kind of foods can make a difference, and strategies that you can employ. So, acidic foods, number one. Things like tomato-based foods, citrus, things with citrus, or soft drinks. Those all are higher in acidity, and those things can increase your risk of reflux. Another one is spicy foods as well. So sometimes I feel like I think about dinner about this a lot, because we're talking about, we talked about nighttime reflux being higher, and what are you eating for dinner? That's a really important thing. But this is true throughout the day as well. Spicy foods, caffeine also makes a difference. Chocolate, onions, what? Onions? I mean, how many times do you have onions in your dinner? Like, we have onions in our dinner most days of the week. It's kind of crazy. Peppermints, spearmint, things like that. Also, beverage-wise, wine, and carbonated beverages also, which we did kind of talk about soft drinks, but carbonated beverages is in general. Those can all increase your risk of reflux. Now, one category, and we talked about it briefly, was higher fat foods. Also can cause problems, again, because it slows that gastric emptying. Now, obviously with CF, and this is true always for CF, a lot of it's about priorities and what your priorities are at that moment, and the most important. If you're not really experiencing symptoms, none of this stuff you really have to worry about too much, right? But if you're experiencing symptoms, it's something you have to think about how you're going to manage it. We're not going to pull fat from our diet. Everybody needs fats. Fats are essential. And for people with CF, it can be even more essential. So if you're struggling to maintain your weight or you're trying to gain weight, you're going to be eating fat, of course. But also for those of us on modulators, we also need fat. We need fat with those as well. So high fat foods, we have to figure out how we can manage those. So one thing is to think about, especially if you have nighttime reflux, is how much fat you're having in a meal at dinner. So if you're having a large, high-fat dinner, you may want to walk back on that. Maybe try to spread your fat out in your earlier meals or snacks during the day. And in general, it's beneficial and valuable to eat smaller, more frequent meals if this is causing you problems. That gives your body time to not be so full, and a smaller meal to digest. That way your body can handle it a little bit better, and that usually can work much better for you. I was thinking about this, like a dinner that would cause you possibly a lot of problems. I was thinking about like pizza. It's tomato based, it's high fat, and let's say you get some soda with it, and you're having soda like a Diet Coke or a Coke or something, and it has caffeine and it's carbonated. A lot of these things can compound on top of each other. So it's important to think about that too. What you're having in entirety, and maybe make some swaps and changes. So let's say at dinner, or let's say you have a spaghetti dinner and you like to drink soda. Maybe instead of both together, you pull the soda and you have water, and then you eat your meal. A lot of it the biggest tool you have is to slowly make changes and see what works. I recommend if people are really seeing that they're having struggles. So let's say you're having nighttime reflux. What you should do is journal. Journaling is a great place to start. You're gonna write down what you're eating. How soon before bed you actually ate. That's something you can do to change it as well. Try not to eat for 3 to 4 hours before bedtime. Obviously, that can be challenging, but the more time you give yourself, the better. And just really write down what's going on and what you're eating. That way you can evaluate, hey, I'm noticing that I have orange juice for breakfast every day and I tend to have reflux in the mornings. Well, maybe it's the orange juice, and maybe you can remove orange juice and swap it with something else. Or if at nighttime you notice when you eat something with tomatoes that you have reflux, and then well, maybe I can't have too many tomatoes or super tomato based items, or maybe I need to push that closer earlier in the day, things like that. So make those swaps. Just journaling and really paying attention to help you learn what is causing you problems specifically, and what swaps you may be able to make based on your own personal symptoms. It doesn't hurt to mention that there are some things you can do outside of nutrition to help with reflux as well. I will mention those here briefly. One of them being elevating the head of your bed by 6 to 8 inches if you have nighttime reflux. That's really can be valuable and beneficial. I know whenever I have reflux at night, I always wake up and then I prop myself up with pillows, and that helps so much for me. Avoiding tobacco, which we should obviously already be doing as people with CF. Well, everyone should, but even more so with CF. But in case you are one of those who partakes in tobacco, that is something that can be causing you additional problems. Avoid tight-fitting clothing. That can also create problems. So again, I think journaling can be really important to say, are some of these things causing me problems? So ladies, we might have to ditch the shapewear. We're finding ourselves having problems. That makes me sad. Obesity as well. So obesity is something that, I talked about, the non-CF population has tended to have more correlation with or association with higher weight or higher BMI and having reflux. Well, the CF community is likely to see more and more of that now that we have modulators and people are beginning to gain more weight, and kind of fall into how what they eat, how actually affects their weight, more like the average non-CF person. So that's something to consider as well. If you have only started experiencing reflux, if you weighed more, then that may be a component that's causing that as well. Of course, there are medications as well. Talk to your team. There are a variety of medications that you can try and see if that helps you with your symptom management. And there's also some surgical procedures as well that you can do. I imagine most of the time they're not going to start there, but that is something that you can try if a bunch of the lifestyle factors and medications don't work for you. Thanks so much for joining me today to learn a little bit more about reflux. I hope you learned something new, and please drop a comment if you have any questions about anything or want some more information about any of the topics I talked about today. Please like and definitely subscribe. The Gut Mini Series will be continuing on with a lot more information. Thanks for joining.